And we're back. Well, this is Gary Lancina and Kim Scribner from CMG, along with our pack and posse of really insightful executive and leadership coaches. We've got a great topic today that we want to discuss. And I think I'll just throw it out there right to start. Um, is it that people really resist change, or is it that people resist uncertainty? And I'm curious to start getting inputs from the collective group here on how your experience might influence your take on that, and how much validity there is in this idea of, even if I'm good with change, uncertainty is what really causes me concern. Sir, I see your head's already nodding. Why don't we jump to you first?
Sure. Hi, folks. I'm Sarah Clark and an Agile team coach. What comes to my mind is that humans are storytelling animals. And so if we don't give them enough information, when we're making a change, they will add in stories. This is just what we do. So the actual change may not be that scary, but when we start telling stories about what it means and adding in additional information, sometimes those can run wild. So the stories we tell are what scare us and make people not want to engage the change.
Yeah, I agree with that, Sarah, right? It's like the uncertainty is more around the unknown creates that fear, right? So that story, our brain takes over, we start going down that rabbit hole, and then it takes so much more effort to bring people back from the brink of that fear than other options that we might have as leaders.
Especially with that change comes a lot of uncertainty around what does it mean for me? And so they're thinking, how is this going to change my job? Am I going to have a job, especially with all the layoffs that we've been seeing for what's been a couple of years now? That becomes very potent for them.
As I'm listening to you ladies talk, what's coming up to me is identity, right? Like we, in many ways, we are our jobs. Whether or not it's right or like it, this is such a big part of our identity. And when our identity gets threatened, we don't respond the best.
Yeah, we should
Interesting.
do that like fight or flight mode, right? As we all commonly talk about. So it's that resistance is the fight.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to I want to go back to something that Sarah Clark actually started with around stories. For me, the start of any successful change is imagining a better future, right? A different future state than what we have now. And I'm going to throw this out there for the group as well. My sense is that if leaders don't provide a believable narrative, it doesn't have to have every detail, but a believable narrative about how to go from where we are to that future state, why we want to get there, what it's going to take, the pros and cons. What will happen in a community, which is essentially any group of humans, is we all start to chatter. And then there's almost a competition of narratives. And those can be influenced by all kinds of things: individual perspective, a sense of common cause, some uncertainty or questioning around the validity or sincerity of leaders, right? But this competition of narratives eventually, sort of through group consensus, settles on the orthodoxy. This is how we're going to react to this. And so I'm kind of curious if that resonates with you. And it starts to lead into the next topic, which is, what are some practical things, given what we've just talked about, that leaders can reduce that uncertainty without overpromising or overcommitting, right? Because I think there's potentially a sweet spot. If you leave everything open to interpretation, then you get this frenzy of what might this look like? But on the other hand, if you try to tell too tight a story, you're probably setting yourself up for some failure as well, because you can't predict everything that's going to happen along that journey. So, you know, from a practical standpoint, how would you respond, and what are some examples from your experience in this space?
So the stories that you're talking about, like we think back to the days when we all worked in a physical location, and there was water cooler talk, right? And so the things that happened around the water cooler became the story. Now you've got, side Slack chats and Teams rooms where people are having those conversations today. And you can't control that. And you don't want to overly control it, because when you're going through a change, you want people to feel like they're having an impact on the change also. So there's this kind of sweet spot of making sure leaders have talking points, but that are not overly prescriptive, right? Their role is to create the clarity, which were all the things that you were talking about, Gary, so that people can ask enough questions and have influence and impact on the change that's happening, so that they feel as though they are part of the change, not that it is happening to them.
Mhm.
And, controlling that water cooler conversation is making sure that there are champions from all levels of the organization, not just from the leadership level, so that the conversation is consistent and flowing everywhere.
Sarah Clark is smirking again. Come on, bring it in.
Perhaps a metaphor to offer. When we think about any big change in our lives, imagine moving into a new home. And so the clarity that someone can offer, like I wouldn't move into a house or an apartment that I haven't toured or seen pictures of. And so the clarity that a leader can offer is like, here's the frame, here are the walls within which we are going to be operating. You get input on how we're going to lay out the furniture, and what are the things that we know, what are the things that we don't know, where's the solid foundation that we can't move, and the things that we can add and embellish and develop together.
I love that. And I'm just thinking the word trust, right? Like, so much uncertainty and so much of the stories that we tell are based on the fact that maybe we don't have a strong basis of trust in our leadership or in our organization. We've been around this bush before. We've seen it play out. It hasn't necessarily been good. And maybe we survived it, but maybe others didn't, or we didn't do it skillfully. So it goes back to, how do we establish trust? And I think what leaders can do, and what is really beneficial for leaders to do, is acknowledge that they don't have all the answers. And it's okay to not have all the answers all the time. And as soon as we as leaders acknowledge that, all of a sudden, the narrative around their agenda dissipates.
To that point, I think hand in glove with trust is authenticity. And there are still persistent beliefs that leaders are supposed to have all the answers, are supposed to be directive. And, for me, a superpower is the ability to say two things: I don't know, and would you help me? And that request for help, most of us feel validated when somebody comes to us and said, I could really use your perspective. So this goes back to a point that was made a little while ago. We've got to leave some space for the participants in change to influence not just the change agenda and objectives, but the process. And I very much appreciate the move into a house or apartment metaphor. Personally, I usually think of this as a vacation trip, or, we're trying to go someplace. This is the destination we want to get to. Here are the stops that, we envision along the way. But are we taking a car, a bus, a train, a plane, hitchhiking, right? There's a lot of room there. And there's also room to influence some of the pace, where we go fast, where we go slow, to help engender that sense of buy-in and trust and commitment. And I guess a theme I would be curious about, and maybe I'll dish it to you, Sarah Smith, just to get you started. But how important is it for people to be able to feel certain in the direction, even if they are uncertain about the details? What kind of pros and cons are there, or how is that played out in your experience?
So when I'm working with clients, what I usually do is I hammer that we have to create clarity. And we have to create clarity to an extent where people are repeating it in their sleep. And when you feel like you're talking about it too much, you're probably starting to talk about it the right amount. And when people are going to get very annoyed with that, hopefully, but that's when you know that you've hit that mark. Creating that clarity is crucial to creating Transparency. This is my cat Lula. She loves this conversation desperately. Um, and so, one thing that when you talk about trust too, and I'm going to deviate a little bit from that question that you actually asked, Gary, because something that keeps coming up for me is that resistance. You know, you have overt resistance and you have covert resistance. And so, how are you bringing that covert resistance out into the open? And through that is trust and that authenticity piece.
Yeah. To that point, there's I would add to the overt and covert resistance, there's also just reluctance. There are people who
Mm-hmm.
are not actively pushing against necessarily a change, but they're also not pulling along with it. And so they create almost passive drag.
Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting one. Somebody smart that I know reminds me on many occasions that all change is conflict because it forces a shift from what we're comfortable with or used to, right? And it's sort of this the devil we know kind of sentiment that even if we know it's bad, it's like we don't like the current state, but we're not really inclined to change it. And so you've got to create some sense of momentum there. And then that gets into, I think, the space you were talking about, which is who's going to resist that? Why are they going to resist it? Are they going to openly revolt? Are they going to be sort of guerrilla warfare-ish? Or are there people who are just like, yeah, we've heard this before. We're going to sit out and wait and see which way the wind blows. I see people nodding their heads again, so I'll be quiet and let you guys chime in on it.
I think there's a piece here about individual difference. So going back to your vacation metaphor, Gary, some of us are going to look at all the reviews of the places that we might be
Yes.
going because we want to know what other people have done. And some people are more comfortable being like, yeah, we'll see how it goes. So there's individual variance there when it comes to uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
And we as humans have an attribution bias where we think if somebody else isn't handling change well, that it's a personal problem for them. Like
Mm.
they lack their personality is such. But if it's about us, we're more likely to say, oh, the situation is complex. And so just paying attention to that, are we putting others in boxes and
Mm-hmm.
attributing it to their personality as they are not capable of change versus what we've been talking about, Sarah's point about clarity, have we created a situation in which people have enough information that they can engage in a way that is productive and helps the whole move forward?
When we
Love that.
talked, Daniela was mentioning trust earlier, right? Is the environment safe where people feel like they can ask questions about the change so that they can get the certainty they need to move forward, right? And so we haven't really talked a lot about techniques, but it's not just about talking at people, it's about having those two-way conversations and being open as leaders or whoever's, guiding the change to hearing those things that you're talking about, Sarah, and having people create the story together rather than the one that's in their minds that they're not saying out loud.
And if they're not going to ask the questions in a large group setting, where are they willing to ask the questions? Because those side conversations are happening. So go to where the side conversations happen and get the feedback and the questions there.
Or potentially create venues for the side conversations to
Yes.
happen, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's that sense of dispersed agency where everybody's participating, I think, is another crucial aspect here. So as we think about this, and this one I'd like to make sure everybody chimes in on. If there was one belief or behavior that you could encourage leaders to take to make this idea of uncertainty, to make this concept more comfortable for the teams they lead, what would that be?
Mine's going to be easy because I go back to clarity all the
Okay.
time. How are you establishing that clarity and making it so that if there's anybody reporting to you that are leaders themselves, how do they know how to talk about it in one-on-ones, in larger group settings, in their own staff meetings?
Mine is naming it. No, just getting it out there. This is hard. This is uncomfortable. There might be elements here that we don't agree with. there might be threats around what this means, right? I think as soon as we name it, we start to take some of the air out of the bubble of the narrative of that water cooler. So that's my little 2 cents there.
I love naming it, love clarity. I'd add coming at it from multiple directions and multiple venues. So if I just said it in a staff meeting, why are there still questions? Think about how many other ways can we add in information and get in information so that there's a full flow of communication happening.
Kim, you looked like you had some perspective.
Yeah, there's two for me. I think clarity is important, but without the context, it's really difficult to tie those two things together. So putting the change into context for the team is super important. And also it's vulnerability, right? Trust comes from vulnerability that can show up in many different ways for different leaders, but you can't show up like you know all the answers. People will, I know I would immediately distrust that. So bringing your questions as well with some certainty, right? You still have to have a leadership pose to that, but you've got to have some vulnerability and be open to hearing the things that others are saying.
So to that point, and maybe this is sort of the bonus round question, when we think about the deliverer of we are going to change news or vision, right? Often there is an individual who has to stand up in front of a group or send out a missive through email or write an article or get interviewed on a stage somewhere. How might we help that individual with their own sense of uncertainty to be comfortable with what you talked about, Kim, vulnerability? Because again, there is this persistent belief among many in leadership positions that they're supposed to know and tell rather than guide and ask. And I'm curious how each of you might approach that, because I'm pretty sure that you've had to deal with that, where a leader says, "I know we need to do this, but," and then all the anxiety bubbles to the surface.
I'd say it depends, and it depends on a lot of factors, like what does their organizational context look like? Who are they? Where do they stand? How are they perceived? And then what is authentic to them? All of those things will determine how that individual might be able to communicate that.
Sarah, any additional thoughts?
I would say access, making sure they have the access to ask the questions they need, get the clarity they need. Once again, I'm like a broken record over here, right? But yeah, giving them that access, helping them look for it.
I think there's some tools that we can provide and coach them on, kind of filling out, thinking through like their sphere of influence and where they have the most influence and where don't they, and being able to identify those limitations so that they can see, okay, I can focus here. I don't have control over that. I'll do my best, but that's outside of my sphere of influence.
And even understanding where others' influences are and creating that influence map amongst the stakeholders.
I love that. And that's probably a topic for another Coach's Corner, which is leadership as team sport. So this has been great. I want to thank everybody who participated today. I love these Coach's Corner conversations. If you want more of this, I encourage anybody who's consumed this video to take a look at the CMG blog. We've got good stuff there in writing and other videos from wise voices like the ones you heard today. And thank you very much.